Hey everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and today we're going to continue our exploration of teacher preparation with a little history lesson. The plan is to zoom out far enough that we can see the origin of teacher certification and our current framework for teacher certification as part of the same landscape. In doing so, we should be able to identify trends as they have unfolded over the nearly 2 centuries since teacher certification began in the US, and also gain a little perspective regarding the bigger picture and context guiding these trends. In order to refocus our frame of reference, we're going to go back to the very beginning. But before we get started, based on feedback I've gotten from a few listeners, I'm going to start adding links to all of the sources upon which I'm drawing for each episode in the bottom of the episode description. So be sure to check there for further reading. Thank you to everyone who's reached out so far to help me make the show better. And as always, you can reach out to professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com with any sort of feedback, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks. Now, in New York and the rest of the country, education was completely decentralized prior to the origin of the common schools movement of the 19th century. What this meant for students in the turn of the 19th century was that school could take one of many different, completely unregulated forms. You might sit at the table and learn basic reading, writing, and sums from a mother who had learned the same thing from her mother, and so on. You might have a private tutor to teach you more or less the same material. Or you might attend one of the locally funded predecessors to public school, or you might even just begin an apprenticeship as soon as you were big enough to learn a trade. Nobody was coming around to ensure that you received a basic education at that time. What this meant for teachers back then, as compared with now, is that you only needed to convince one or two or a few stakeholders that you were competent enough to teach. There was no framework for earning a certificate, so a good interview and perhaps a simple demonstration of your academic acumen would likely get you the job. The common schools movement was well underway in the early part of the 19th century, but it gained traction with Horace Mann's election to secretary of the newly established Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837. It was his philosophy and that of his constituents that something needed to be done about the disparities in education available in his state. He saw school as a means of ensuring that every citizen would have access to an education in moral, non-sectarian Christian values, as well as an understanding of how to engage in a democratic society. He thus made it his mission to establish free, publicly funded and managed common schools that served as the blueprint for similar schools established throughout the remaining states. New York was an early mover in respect to common schools. There was a law on the books in New York as early as 1812 authorizing local officials to establish common school districts to be managed by elected trustees. Each of these districts would have a 1 or 2 room schoolhouse where children aged 5 to 15 would learn reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, and geography for free. Provided the school operated 3 months out of the year, it could count on funding from the state to supplement the local funding, and by the mid-1800s, there were over 10,000 common school districts in the state of New York. Those of us involved with public education, either as teachers, students, alumni, parents, what have you, understand, just as Horace Mann did, that it is one of the basic building blocks of a democratic society to have public schools. So the development of common schools throughout the state and the country was absolutely a revolutionary step in making it possible to develop an informed and capable voter base. Before we get too carried away, though, it is important to point out that much of the population of the US prior to 1865 was still enslaved. And even in Massachusetts, a supposedly free state where slavery had been formally outlawed since 1783, these common schools, meant to be free and open to all, were only actually free and open to white students. Even beyond this most egregious injustice, the common schools had a long way to go in rectifying the disparities between schools in cities and schools in the rural parts of the country. We will return to the question of the differences between city schools and rural schools in the early years of New York's common schools when we get to the particulars of teacher certification. So major irreconcilable injustices woven historically into the framework of our society aside, the common school movement was the origin in the US of the idea that education is a public good, something that a society should be responsible for providing to its members. It transforms children from the responsibility of their parents into citizens deserving of a service, and teachers from somewhat specialized providers of a private service, not all that different from like accountants or groundskeepers, into public servants, individuals who are answering a call to serve a need in a society. This is a major transformation. It's a very interesting moment in history for teachers for that very reason, because this status, something we've discussed at some length in the very first episode of this show, is something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, teachers are recognized for their importance to a society and sometimes even celebrated for their sacrifices to the mission of teaching our society's children. In a mostly failing society with the greatest wealth inequality of any country in the global north, children are the only source of hope a lot of us have. So people in general can get behind the goal of educating the children. On the other hand, the US is uniquely situated as an objectively rich country that historically refuses to spend money on itself in terms of infrastructure and anything else that would fall under the umbrella of the public good. So while we're currently living with the results of the most drastic period of deregulation of industry and defunding of public goods in history, which kicked off in the late 70s and early 80s, 1970s, 1980s, I should specify, since we're getting into history here, we can see a glimmer of what was to come in the process of forming publicly funded schools. So let me break that down a little bit. By 1814, it was the legal responsibility of town and city officials throughout New York State to set up common school districts. Education was no longer a private matter handled solely by local communities, churches, or the parents, all on their own, but rather a matter of state provision. With this development, namely a state budget, the old way of acquiring a teaching position was no longer sufficient. Teachers now needed to be certified. When I say certified, though, I'm not talking about anything like we have now, as the only requirements to teach were actually, literally, good moral character and the ability to teach. Certification remains to this day a deceptively subjective matter, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But from 1814 to 1856, the process of obtaining a certificate was decentralized to the cities and towns of New York State, where as a teacher, you had to find a way of demonstrating your good moral character and your ability to teach. That's it. By and large, this involved bringing the trustees of a common school district a letter of recommendation. By mid-century, there was growing concern that the decentralized recommendation-based system was not an effective means of ensuring accountability in the thousands of schools operating across the state. I found an article in the August 13th, 1856 edition of the New York Times summarizing the meeting in which the State Schools Commission took over the task of licensing teachers. It reads as follows.
New
York State School Commissioners' first annual meeting. The commissioners of the state, elected under the new school law, met on Thursday at Troy. Honorable Victor M. Rice, state superintendent, was called to the chair. There was a large number of the commissioners present, and generally speaking, they were a fine-looking body of school officers. Several of the commissioners gave a detailed statement of the number and condition of the schools in their respective districts. The body assumed its deliberations on Friday. Honorable S.S. Randall of New York City submitted the following resolutions which elicited a long discussion. Resolved that we regard a thorough and efficient supervision of our schools not only desirable, but absolutely indispensable, and we will cordially cooperate with our state superintendent in furtherance of this object. Resolved that none but well-qualified teachers, both morally and intellectually, should be employed in any of our school districts. Resolved that this convention request the superintendent of public instruction to authorize the commissioners to grant licenses that shall be valid for certain specified districts for a limited time. There was a free interchange of views in regard to educational affairs generally. The state superintendent, Mr. Rice, and our New York City superintendent, Mr. Randall, were peculiarly happy and forcible in their remarks and suggestions. The resolutions were adopted. The meeting, although an experiment, will doubtless be productive of much good. So there you have it. Though the state commissioners had centralized the process, the requirements hadn't actually changed. Recommendations were still a valid means of acquiring a teaching license. The 1864 school law, which dealt primarily with reorganizing the management of schools in order to address corruption, was the first major modification to this approach to certifying teachers. It required the state commissioners to offer examinations instead of relying solely on personal recommendations. This also happened to be the year that the Regents of the University of the State of New York launched the first statewide system of standardized testing in the U.S. Thus, standardization was taking on greater importance in New York, with the idea being that standardization in measuring student achievement and in measuring teacher preparation would yield favorable results in New York schools and lend credibility to what was happening in the schools. The general feeling leading up to this was that without standardization, there was no way of ensuring that students and teachers were up to snuff, so a few tests, both for students and for teachers, ought to clear things up. To return to another old article in the New York Times, a brief summary of the 1864 law wraps up with a little editorial note that reads as follows. This law, if effectually carried out, will thus remedy not a few of the many faults of our present public school system. By 1887, there was a statewide certification exam for public school teachers outside of cities, and then 10 years later, the statewide certification requirements became the minimum requirements to which cities could add their own requirements. New York City, for example, had its own certification process beyond the state minimum up until 1990. To recap the story thus far, education prior to 1812 was catch as catch can, with the children of wealthy families typically learning from tutors or attending private schools, and everybody else picking up a little schooling provided by a local church or parents, if anything at all. After 1812, a basic education became a public good funded through emerging partnerships between the state and localities in New York. Over time, the individuals funding this basic education, namely taxpayers, began to question whether they were getting their money's worth, and the state government took over the certification process to fix the situation through standardization. And they all lived happily ever after, right? This is where it gets interesting. Teacher preparation was a brand new field, And while New York State had gotten into the teacher education game as early as 1827 and 1834 with legislation funding normal schools, which were teacher training schools, and academies for teachers, there was very little educational infrastructure dedicated to preparing teachers. In this, too, New York was an early mover, with the legislature establishing a model normal school in Albany in 1844. There were 12 normal schools throughout the state before the turn of the 20th century, but throughout the first century of public education in New York, there were not enough teachers coming out of these programs to shoulder the full burden of staffing the schools. This meant that the certificate, the teaching certificate, could not be tied to a teacher's having attended school for teacher preparation, which meant that there needed to be an alternative pathway, which meant that there was no real incentive to attend school for teacher preparation because there was an alternative pathway. Does this sound familiar? Even with a standard certification examination across the state, the exam itself had to be made easy enough that a sufficient number of people could pass it to fill the open teaching positions in the state. In a school conforming to the state minimum requirements for teacher certification, one could therefore get a teaching job with just a high school diploma and a temporary license. This was the first time New York State had encountered this conundrum, but it would not be the last. And the conundrum to which I refer, of course, is that increased requirements without a commensurate increase in compensation will inevitably lead to a decrease in those willing to comply, or a hollowing out of the increased requirements, or both. In other words, something has to give in order to balance the equation of work and compensation. At this point in the story, the variable that changed was, thankfully, compensation, although it took really ugly circumstances to bring it about. And those ugly circumstances were the First World War. The First World War caused such extreme inflation that teacher salaries became next to worthless in the early 20s. In order to put an end to the drastic teacher shortage that resulted, the state established a minimum statewide teacher salary and increased funding to schools generally. With this minimum salary in place, the state could end the certification exam pathway and replace it with a professional education requirement in 1924. So the exam was out, and you now had your certificate tied to your professional education in a normal school. The normal school program had already been extended from 2 to 3 years. So more education for more money. In this way, balance was restored, and there were not only enough teachers, but enough qualified teachers to staff New York's public schools. Then, of course, the Great Depression happened. For a little more background on the Great Depression, be sure to listen to episode 2 of the show from a month ago. Anyway, teaching is often characterized as a recession-proof career. No matter what, you gotta have schools. And so the Great Depression absolutely bore this out, as there was a huge teacher surplus leading into the 1930s. With the equation once again out of balance, certification requirements could be increased again to include a 4-year bachelor's degree and continuing education. The latter requirement for continuing education is the origin of the professional development required on a 5-year rolling basis to maintain a professional certification today. A 5th year of study was added to the requirements for high school teachers in 1943 and for elementary school teachers in 1966. The concept of reciprocity grew out of a need to keep up with the needs of the baby boom generation after the Second World War. From 1949 on, the Regents began offering reciprocity on a case-by-case basis to teachers with licenses from other states. By 1968, teacher training was decentralized again as the state relinquished control of teacher preparation to university programs. New York also got caught up in the wave of support that spread nationwide for competency-based teacher certification, as opposed to certification based on the completion of a professional program. Thus, standardized tests returned to the teacher preparation pathway in 1972 and basically reopened the door to alternative pathways to teacher certification, which followed not too long after. The early versions of our current standardized testing program did not look all that different from the tests we take now to become teachers. Thus, we arrive at the present day in which any prospective certified teacher has to have passed at least 3 standardized tests, the EAS, the EdTPA, and at least 1 CST, depending on their certification area. For a little recap on what these tests are, listen back to episode 4 from 2 weeks ago, as well as a forthcoming deep dive on what these tests are all about and how to prepare for them. For now, though, I would like to do a little reading from a pair of articles from the New York Times. The first, from 6 years ago, is by Elizabeth Harris and is entitled "Judge Rules Second Version of New York Teachers Exam is Also Racially Biased." It reads as follows. A federal judge on Friday found that an exam for New York teaching candidates was racially discriminatory because it did not measure skills necessary to do the job, the latest step in a court battle over teacher qualifications that has spanned nearly 20 years. The exam, the second incarnation of the liberal arts and sciences test, called the Last Two, was administered from 2004 through 2012 and was designed to test an applicant's knowledge of liberal arts and science. But the test was found to fail minority teaching candidates at a higher rate than white candidates. According to Friday's decision, written by Judge Kimba M. Wood of Federal District Court in Manhattan, the pass rate for African American and Latino candidates was between 54% and 75% of the pass rate for white candidates. Once it was established that minority candidates were failing at a disproportionately high rate, the burden shifted to education officials to prove that the skills being tested were necessary to do the job. Otherwise, the test would be ruled discriminatory. In creating the test, the company National Evaluation Systems sent surveys to educators around New York State to determine if the test's content objectives were relevant and important to teaching. The samples for both surveys were small, however, Judge Wood said. The judge found that National Evaluation Systems, now called Evaluation Systems, part of Pearson Education, went about the process backward. Instead of beginning with ascertaining the job tasks of New York teachers, the 2 last examinations began with the premise that all New York teachers should be required to demonstrate an understanding of the liberal arts, Judge Wood said. Joshua Sohn, a partner at the firm Mishcon de Rea, who represents the prospective teachers in that case, echoed that sentiment. They started with the conclusion, without any support, that this is what you actually need to know to be an effective teacher, Mr. Sohn said. With this ruling, the Last Two meets the same fate as the Last One, an earlier version of the test given from 1993 to 2004 that was also found to be discriminatory. It was not immediately clear how many people would be affected by the decision or how much this might cost New York City. So far, about 3,900 people have filed claim forms over the first version of the exam. Mr. Sohn said the compensation is still being litigated. Some of those people worked as substitutes and may now be eligible for full-time positions, while others had already been promoted because they met other hiring requirements. Mr. Sohn said thousands of people presumably took the second exam version while it was in use, and under Title VII, the federal prohibition on employment discrimination, minority candidates who failed might be entitled to back pay. This ruling applies only to the city, but could have ramifications for the rest of the state, where the test was also used. Nicholas Paolucci, a spokesman for the New York City Law Department, said Friday that Judge Wood's decision was expected and we will proceed accordingly. A spokesman for the New York State Education Department, which establishes certification criteria for teachers, declined to comment. Neither version of the exams is still in use in New York. Instead, the state administers a new test called the Academic Literacy Skills Test, or the ALST, along with a slate of other assessments. Now, an article by Kate Taylor from not even 2 years later, entitled "Regents Drop Teacher Literacy Test Seen as Discriminatory," which reads as follows. The Board of Regents on Monday eliminated a requirement that aspiring teachers in New York State pass a literacy test to become certified, after the test proved controversial because Black and Hispanic candidates passed it at significantly lower rates than white candidates. The Regents also moved forward with a proposal that would allow some students who failed another test, aimed at evaluating practical skills like lesson planning and assessment, to be certified as teachers based on their grades and professors' recommendations. Together, the steps signal how much the Regents' approach has changed under the current Chancellor, Betty A. Rosa, after several years of efforts to raise the bar for entering the profession. Under the previous chancellor, Merrill H. Tisch, the state created a set of more rigorous licensing exams. Among them was the Academic Literacy Skills Test, or ALST, which was intended to assess reading and analytical writing skills, and the EdTPA, which requires candidates to submit a portfolio of work, including unedited videos of them interacting with students. The literacy test proved challenging to many prospective teachers, but particularly for Black and Hispanic candidates. An analysis done in 2014, the year the test was first administered, found that 64% of white candidates passed the test on the first try, while only 46% of Hispanic candidates and 41% of Black candidates did. Nonetheless, a federal judge who had found 2 older certification tests to be discriminatory ruled in 2015 that the ALST was not biased because it measured skills that were necessary for teaching. However, deans of education schools, especially those with large numbers of Black and Hispanic students, disagreed and argued that the exam was exacerbating a shortage of teachers of color. More than 80% of public school teachers in the country are white, according to the Federal Education Department, while a majority of public school students are not. Others said that the exam was redundant, given the other requirements to become a teacher. Michael Middleton, Dean of Hunter College School for Education, said in an interview on Monday that the battery of exams currently required of teacher candidates, 4 in most cases, was onerous and expensive, and that eliminating the ALST was appropriate. We already know that our licensure candidates have a bachelor's degree, which in my mind means they have basic literature and communication skills, Dr. Middleton said. So what are we to make of this? Most proximately, this would be the 3rd strike against Pearson in just one facet of teacher preparation. Yet they continue to have their hands all over the place in public education, including in a $6 million contract with the New York City Department of Education in June 2020, just as budgets were starting to take hits related to the pandemic. $1.7 million of this contract was for a 1-year extension of a standardized test for 4-year-olds, supposedly measuring giftedness. You wouldn't have to be an expert in assessment to suspect that such a test might be correlated too much with class and race to have any validity or reliability. But that is also, incidentally, exactly what the experts are saying about the test. Yet, the DOE spent $1.7 million for a 1-year extension to that test. Anyway, that's just a brief aside. Big picture, teacher certification seems to be a policy tool that serves 2 purposes. On the one hand, it is a means of reassuring stakeholders that the teachers know generally what they are doing. But behind the scenes, it's also a means of regulating the scarcity or surplus of teachers. When there are too few teachers, the process is opened up to alternatives, and when there is a surplus, it is made more selective. What then are we to make of the perpetual teacher shortage of the past 20 years, and is there a chance the equation might be balanced like it was in the 20s, with a higher salary and more funding for public education? I suppose we can dream. And if you happen to have policymaker friends, be sure to send them to patreon.com/professional development, where we have all of the answers for anybody who can spare our $3 per month consulting fee. Now, for this week's news update. Some good news. New York public school employees are now mandated to get a vaccine. The first dose has to be administered by September 27th at the latest, which means schools will get just a little bit safer by October 27th. The UFT is thankfully not one of the city workers' unions fighting the mandate, though we do have a small but vocal contingent complaining about the mandate. In other news, Teacher's Choice is back. We will get our $250 to spend on materials this year, having not gotten that money last year. It turns out we will be paid an additional $225 to set up online classrooms for situations in which one or all of our students are forced out of our physical classrooms due to the need to quarantine. As a tech-savvy teacher, I thoroughly look forward to clocking the time it takes me to set up my 7 Google Classrooms in the hopes of achieving an hourly rate of $700 or more when the money is dispersed on October 31st. The DOE seems to have finally realized that the math doesn't add up to have 2 classes happening simultaneously in the event that a class is partially quarantined. So there is also a provision for per-session pay in that event. To an outsider, it probably doesn't seem like a big deal to be compensated for your labor, but this is a very exciting development for a teacher because this doesn't happen very often. Thank you so very much for sticking with me through episode 6. I hope you'll tune in next week for another Patreon exclusive episode in which we will continue our exploration of teacher preparation with a conversation with the New York City Teaching Fellow alumnus. You will be able to access that full episode at patreon.com/professional development. In the meantime, the best way to support the show, outside of subscribing to the Patreon, is to subscribe to the free feed wherever you do your podcast listening, and tell your friends and colleagues about us as well. Thanks again. We'll catch you at the same time next week at patreon.com/professional development.